when energy is surging at its peak. We're happy that we got a good critical mass of you to come forward. I'm Dan Vermeer. I'm a professor at the Fuqua School of Business with an adjunct appointment at the Environment School as well. I also run a Center for Energy Development in the Global Environment called the EDGE Center at the Business School. And I've been fascinated by issues of water for a very long time. And I am really excited about the panel that we've been able to bring together for a discussion of water financing. I think we will touch on some of the issues that have come up over the course of the day, but maybe with a little bit different angle and trying to understand the movement of capital and its relationship to water issues and how that impacts the system that we have. So our superstar panel today includes Martin Doyle, who's professor at the Nicholas School, working also this year on water infrastructure issues with Build America. Derek Gardels, who's a project engineer at the Army Corps and Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the Corps last year. And Jeff Hughes, who's on the faculty at UNC School of Government and director of the Environmental Finance Center at UNC. So I think each of them brings a kind of a unique perspective to this issue. The way we're going to structure this is roughly in thirds. I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to queue up some of the issues that we want to talk about today with their kind of initial introductions and opening statements. We'll then transition to a Q&A phase where I have several questions I'd like to get deeper on with them. And in the final phase, we'll look to hear what you're interested in as well. So be developing your questions, and hopefully we have more of an organic discussion in the latter third of the session that we have today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Martin. Martin, thanks for joining the panel, and looking forward to Martin's role, which is to kind of set the table for our conversation.
All right, bottled water. Jim Salzman would be punching us in the face. All right, so I'm normally here in the Nick School, and I teach a water infrastructure finance class that you all should take. This water infrastructure and finance is usually the most bland of vanilla topics. It's crucially important, but completely boring, and it's represented by 4 middle-aged white guys sitting in front of you right now, which is kind of a lot of water infrastructure meetings. That's kind of the audience that you get. I want to start with just thinking about the fact that up until kind of recently, the ability to travel around the U.S. and drink water out of almost any tap is one of the most profound technological and financial developments in the history of the world. And I always start one of my classes with this, but I don't want to ever lose sight of the fact that we have accomplished something in the United States that's actually mind-blowing in the history of humanity and society. The way I want to set the stage is through a few historical events. I want to think about the theme that's come up a lot is federalism. I want to talk about fiscal federalism, and starting back in the colonial era and going until the present with a couple key dates, right? So keep in mind 1837, 1893, 1933, and we'll just pick 1986. We'll go with Reagan for the last one, okay? So, and where money was money coming and where was money going during that period of time? So colonial era up until 1837, the central player in budgets and in taxes was state governments. And so this was the era when almost all of the revenue was going into the states. So up until 1837, 80% of total government debt in the United States was held by state governments, 13% was held by local governments, and only 1.5% of total government debt was held by the federal government. So all of the action financially was happening at the state level. A lot of this money was going to canals, so canal building and road building was one of the big things, and the way that revenue was generated was by taxing the actual use of that infrastructure of canals. So 1837 was the big first financial collapse, and this was the first technological collapse. It was kind of the tech boom of the 1830s was canals. All of that went kind of belly up because it turns out the only canal that made money was the Hudson or the Erie Canal, and everything else went belly up, including the Neuse River Canal, the Cape Fear Canal, and a bunch of other ones that are right here in North Carolina. After that, the state governments constrained themselves with their ability to collect revenue, to actually tax, and the federal government wasn't willing to step in. And so from 1837 up through all the way through the end of the 19th century, the central point of the fiscal part of government was local governments. So local governments stepped in, they taxed the bejesus out of everyone, And they actually did a lot of the work. So states were fiscally constrained. The cities filled the gap. About 72% of total government debt in the 1870s was held by local governments. And so all of the money was being generated by that, and most of this was being generated by property taxes, okay? So the fiscal structure of the United States went from being taxing by revenues on these infrastructure projects to being generated by property taxes. The federal government itself was largely inert. And these local governments were actually very fiscally sound. So being an academic, I get into nerdy kinds of things, and I looked at the two most stable investments that you could make in the 1890s before and after the collapse of 1893. Municipal bonds and railroad corporate bonds. And I looked at the interest rates on both of those types of bonds. Municipal bonds had the same interest rate as corporate railroad bonds, which showed that they were very, very stable investments, and the interest rates didn't change before and after 1893. So while all these other kinds of corporations were going bankrupt, railroad bonds, municipal bonds were very, very stable. And we're going to see that throughout the history of the United States, that municipal bonds, except for the Great Depression, are boring, but they're safe. And that's kind of the signature of water infrastructure. The next big pivot point was 1914, and the 16th Amendment was passed, and I need a law student to tell me what the 16th Amendment allowed us to do. I bet a Harvard law student might know that, right? Oh. Okay, so we won't go with a law student. We'll go with a woman who has a British education. Katie. Okay, we could collect income taxes. So we could generate revenue from income taxes by the federal government. So that was made possible in 1913. The first income taxes were taken in 1914. And before 1920, revenue from income tax made up about 20% of total revenues for total government revenue. And after 1945, you had the Great Depression, state governments couldn't have money, local governments weren't able to generate money. After 1945, over 50% of total government revenue started to come from income taxes. So in a period of about 30 years, we went from the federal government being essentially fiscally inert to the federal government being the central point of where revenue was coming in. And as economic historians have often pointed out, this pivot in 1945 from then on was really the fundamental pivot in taxing and revenue generation and debt holding in the economic history of the United States. This was a very big moment. From then on, ironically, one of the big sources of revenue for state and local governments was the federal government itself. So they would tax a lot through these income taxes at the federal level, and then they would pass on those revenues to the state and local governments. So just looking at the state level, about 30% of state and local revenues were these federal government pass-throughs in the 1970s. In certain cities, it was particularly acute. 55% of the total budget of St. Louis was federal grants. 70% of Buffalo, New York's revenue was from federal grants in 1970. For sewerage, this was for sewage infrastructure, for water infrastructure, this was really the pivot point as well about where money was coming from. And so during this period from in the 1930s, the Great Depression, one of the ways that FDR used the Works Progress Administration was to build sewers. So we usually associate the Great Depression and the Civilian Conservation Corps as being kind of, they were building dams, they were building levees and doing all these kinds of big things. They were also doing the nasty work of building sewers. And in fact, the North Durham wastewater treatment plant, that the first time that it was built, 1937, that was built with federal grant dollars, and that's how it actually got built. So the vast majority of sewage treatment plants, about 65% of sewage treatment plant in the United States, its first beginnings were with WPA spending. So federal government got it going. Federal government really kept it going, starting with the Federal Water Pollution Control Act 1956, follow-up one in 1960, and then the Clean Water Act in 1972. We often associate it with regulations, but the big thing that the Clean Water Act did was spend a metric ton of money. And they spent a lot of money on infrastructure. The combination of that with the tax-exempt municipal bonds is really the way that the federal government has subsidized water and wastewater infrastructure through the history of the United States. Now, I think Derek and Tom can certainly speak to the big federal infrastructure that we think of, dams and levees and things like that. But the next big change was really in the 1986 WRDA, Water Resources Development Act, which cut off a lot of that federal spigot. And also in the 1990s, what we started to see was in 1991, the federal share of spending on wastewater infrastructure was down at 5%. So it had gone from 50 and 60% down to 5% in a matter of decades. So what we end up with just in the water and wastewater side, just setting the stage for where we are now, is we've gone from an era when, over about a 50-year period, we were taxing revenues at the federal scale. Those federal dollars were being passed through to the local scale, and we built a lot of infrastructure during that window of time, and we built it under assumptions of climate, population, land use, these things, and we also built it under an assumption that the economy would be structured in a certain way. And so what we're seeing now is we are now possibly at the peak of that pendulum swing on the other side, where there are no more federal dollars that are coming in very easily. Population is contracting from this big spatial footprint back to urban centers. And on top of it, we're seeing issues of climate change, we're seeing issues of aging infrastructure. So that's kind of the setting that we're sitting in now.
Thank you for that historical perspective. My name's Derek Gardels. I'm a project engineer actually at HDR now. I recently transitioned. So I have a background in engineering, and then now, more recently, a background in policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that duality. But when I was in engineering doing water and wastewater design work, we were managing a very large infrastructure program, a $2 billion program over years. And what we came to realize is the problems weren't technical. We understood the technical, there was hiccups, but we understood the technical solutions. But we were struggling with the regulatory and the financial issues to deliver these projects. And so I had an opportunity to go to the Corps through American Association for the Advancement of Science to do a science and technology policy fellowship. And I really have enjoyed the opportunity to look at the federal perspective of delivering infrastructure. And in light of what Martin just elaborated on, the federal government, and I'm speaking for myself, not for HDR or for the Corps, but the federal government is realizing that the business model that they use to develop the United States and to build all this infrastructure isn't the same model they're going to use moving forward. Recapitalizing, or likely could not be, or will not be the same model moving forward. And so we're exploring public-private partnerships and alternative financing mechanisms to do that. And recently, in 2014, the president signed the Water Resources Reform Development Act, and there were two provisions in there that had some focus on public-private partnerships. Section 5014, which authorized a pilot program for 15 public-private partnership projects, and then also the WIFIA, Title C, Water Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act, which provides loan guarantees to water infrastructure for both the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers. And I guess before I jump into the alternative financing program itself, I really want to define a term that's used a lot, but sometimes misused or at least used differently. When I'm speaking of public-private partnerships, I'm not using the World Bank definition, because I think traditional projects under traditional delivery with the Bureau of Rec or the Corps would fit under that, where they're talking about forms of cooperation between the public and private sectors for design, build, finance. Traditional delivery in the Corps' model fits under that. So when I speak about public-private partnerships, I'm talking about projects with three functional criteria. When you have an outcome focus instead of a prescriptive input focus. So in traditional delivery, you're specifying the pump, the material, the valving, the piping, the type of pipe, cast iron versus stainless steel. In a public-private partnership, you're looking at outcomes. How do I get 35 gallons per minute from point A to point B? They're also looking at a service delivery concept, looking at the infrastructure service instead of the asset. There's incentivized risk sharing. So equity is at risk. There are some P3s that have their 100% debt, but generally when we're talking about public-private partnerships, there's a profit motive and there is equity at stake for taking on the additional risk. And then also, I want to make the distinction between P3s and privatization. Privatization is a full transfer, and generally when we're talking about P3s, I'm still referring to the public ownership. And so I really think it's important to make that distinction, at least up front. So you have traditional delivery on one end of the spectrum, privatization on the other, and P3 is something in the continuum between those with those functional criteria. The business case for P3s at the federal level, I think Tom, in the keynote address, really laid that out really well. The burning platform for the Corps, the stated objective of the program is really to extend, for existing infrastructure, to sustain performance, extend service life, or buy down risk. And so the risks have gone up as the infrastructure has aged. They're looking to reduce that risk. And for new infrastructure, they're trying to accelerate delivery to reduce life cycle costs and accrue project benefits earlier. One of the biggest problems that we have at the federal level, or that they have at the federal level, is that they spread the peanut butter really thin, as they like to say. They have lots of projects going on at once, and they minimally fund those projects over long periods of time. and the projects inevitably take too long and cost too much, or at least that's the accusation. And so with P3s, one of the big advantages is that you are able to get the capital up front, and you're able to execute, the private sector is able to use innovation to execute those quickly, and the nation realizes those benefits more quickly, is at least the platform. And Tom talked a lot about the backlog with the Bureau of Rec, and I think it's amazing to me how similar the two stories are between the two agencies. We've got a $60 billion, or the Corps has a $60 billion backlog that's authorized projects that Congress felt had value but have been not appropriated. There's a performance gap. We're seeing reliability decrease on the inland navigation system with lockage outages, unexpected lockage outages. The hydropower performance, we're the largest federal hydropower producer. And I think the industry average, I might get these numbers wrong, but the industry average is, I think, is around 97% reliability, or 98% even. The Corps is seeing now down to around 87%. So there's benefits that the nation is foregoing, by unfunding or not optimally funding this infrastructure. And in addition to all this, with climate change, population growth, economies changing, as Martin alluded to, there's new challenges. It's not just servicing the requirements of the existing infrastructure that was built in the 1930s through the 60s and into the early 70s. It's also about, how do we address resiliency? And we have a tendency too often to do, reactive investments. If you look at the supplemental appropriations, sometimes are a significant share of what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers does. As soon as Hurricane Sandy hits, a lot of those projects that never would have got funded all of a sudden get funded. And so how do we proactively make investments before the storm instead of reactively afterwards? So there's a need for a 21st century business model, and this is something that we're exploring. The challenge that the Corps is now realizing is there's several administrative and legislative constraints to this new paradigm. And in looking at public-private partnerships for the federal government, on the legislative side, the Corps does not have the authority to generate revenue. So even if they did do a lockage fee on the inland waterway, similar to what is done on a toll road, they cannot collect that. Even if they couldn't ring fence it. That would go to the Treasury. So if you think about hydropower and that business line, it seems like it's ripe for a P3. The tough part for hydropower is that those monies have to go to the Treasury. And then there's discussion beyond that. Even if they were able to ring fence those, they may be budget offsets. So anyway, there's those two legislative constraints. The next problem on the administration side is that there's OMB scoring rules that dictate that you can't commit future Congresses to payments. So if you have a 30-year, typical 30-year concession, the full amount of that project cost would have to be scored in the year in which it was procured. So, for example, P3s often can be as much as $300 million over 30 years, so it's $10 million a year. Instead of just trying to get $10 million through the budget, where you can't service all your other requirements, you have to get the full $300 million. So it's a non-starter, and that goes along with the availability payment issue. And there's also an OMB budget priority issue that we're dealing with, because we're looking at they're looking at P3s to deliver projects that are in that authorized backlog. However, it's difficult to use P3 as a justification to get projects funded that hadn't risen to the priority in the first place. And so I guess because of the last note I was going to make is that because of the policy challenges that we have, the Corps is looking at public-private partnerships. So it's called a P4. And in the most mature concept that exemplifies that is the Fargo-Moorhead Metro project. But essentially what they're doing is they're splitting the project up in two. And it's a $2 billion project that, because of the P3 on the local end, they're reducing the cost by $400 million, saving 8 years off the delivery schedule. And that $400 million would be transferred to the federal government savings. So their share goes from $800 million down to $400 million. But it hasn't been funded yet. It's a concept that we're still evaluating. And it's not a true federal P3. It's what we're calling a P4. And the P3 is really at the local end. But I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Great, thanks. So when we were talking about what we were going to talk about with water finance, we kind of split up the components, and I decided that I was going to talk about where I think most of the resources for any of these projects starts, and that's with individual users. So I was going to talk a little bit about water bills, wastewater bills, and user fees. I think today we've talked about a lot of different types of water projects. The work that I tend to do in our center tend to focus on, don't get into some of the really important water resource projects like dams and irrigation. We tend to focus more on the municipal infrastructure, the kind of stuff that our friends in Durham are responsible for. That includes water plants, wastewater plants, sewer systems, water distribution systems, also stormwater. Most stormwater is managed by county and municipal governments across the country. And usually when I'm at a finance event, pretty early on, you can almost make this a drinking game. Someone's going to talk about what is the national need for water infrastructure, pretty much. And then when they say it, that you can win your bet. So nobody, I don't think anybody said it yet, but it's so I'll say it. It's anywhere from 600 billion to $1 trillion, depending on your favorite source for these things. These big numbers. And that again is for water, wastewater, stormwater. That doesn't cover some of these other projects. So my head explodes when I hear those big numbers. Again, I like to think more about the individual level. For me, what's interesting, and we do some of the other work on the financial mechanisms, but what's really interesting is the pricing, the $30 to $100 to $150 that individual families pay on a monthly basis for these services, because that all kind of bubbles up. And if the past, with the exception of some of those big epic kind of periods we had with federal government involvement, but if the rest of the past is a lesson, most of that 600 billion to $1 trillion is going to come from aggregating those small pots of money. So, so in order to give a perspective on that, it's in the news right now. It's very timely. I mean, water finance is just, it's an exciting and maybe depressing time for water finance with places like Flint and Detroit and some other situations. So I just turned to headlines, today's headlines, last week's headlines, to give you some ideas about what's on my mind. But I think it characterizes some interesting aspects of water finance. So just in no particular order, KRCR News, Channel 6. It's the Severe Weather First station. If you're from Northern California, their heading last week was "Paradise Poised to Raise Water Rates, Conservation Partly to Blame." So we have trouble in paradise when even paradise has high water rates. So it's kind of a dismal status. But if you read this article, which, and I can't get enough of these kind of geeky water rate articles, you would see that this is a small water utility in Northern California that, like many water utilities across the country, including many in North Carolina, have a pricing structure that hasn't adapted to the changing demands. The pricing structure for most water utilities is most of their revenue comes from selling gallons of water. Anywhere from 80 to 95% for the average utility comes from the volumetric part of what they price. Then they have a fixed fee that may come, for some utilities may cover 25 or 30% of their total revenue, but generally it's pretty small, and for many it's 5% of their revenue. Durham's probably 15%, something 20% of their revenue comes from that fixed fee. So what that means is in places like California, where there's mandatory requirements for reducing water sales by 25%, revenue tanks. What do you think happens to a utility's cost when their sales goes down 25%? Who thinks their costs go down 25%? Raise your hand. Who thinks they go down 20%? Raise your hand. A few people. Who thinks they go down 10%? Raise your hand. The answer is it depends on each individual utility, but for many utilities, you drop your sales down by 25%, your costs go down 2 or 3%. That, you don't need to be a water finance expert to know that gives you a disconnect. And that's what's happening to a lot of our utilities. The reason for that disconnect is there's all this legacy infrastructure, big plants that have been invested, bank debt to pay off. That part does not go up and down with the amount of water that's in their pipes and goes through. So that's sort of where we are. So there's a lot of places like Paradise that are struggling with this new demand. And conservation, which is in California, it's a law. And in many other places, it's become the guide, it's become an ethic. It doesn't necessarily mesh with how we price water, wastewater. And a lot of places have had to increase rates, really increase the way they price. So it's a big front page issue in a lot of areas. So another interesting headline, I think it was yesterday, Detroit Free Press, income-based water rate plan nixed for Detroit. Okay, another interesting thing, I'll read it again, income-based water rate plan nixed for Detroit. Another really interesting pricing issue across our country is that we treat water like a private good. The way we finance at the local level, even if it's run by a government, is that the people that benefit from the service pay for it in proportion to how much service they use. This is very different than the way we price a lot of other governmental services. National security, police protection, social services. Those are all priced usually based on your ability to pay. We pay through taxes, you make more money, you pay more toward those services. So water, wastewater, we really treat as a private good in most areas. There's a few places like Detroit where incomes have gotten so low, being able to pay for this essential service has been really difficult. And places like Detroit are saying, do we need to treat water like we treat these other services? Food, we have a huge food stamp program across the country. Heating, we have a national heating assistance program. So places like Detroit are looking at it. Now, the folks in Detroit, and they're going to issue this report next week, have determined that it's illegal in Michigan to do an income-based water rate plan. So this is a really big issue. In North Carolina, we believe that it's illegal to do an income-based pricing structure in North Carolina. In many states, it's illegal based on constitutional issues, based on provisions that prohibit cross-subsidization. So it's hardwired into the way we price it. It's become a real interesting issue, and for many utilities, dealing with this affordability issue is really challenging, and they're trying to figure out how they can do it with these legal barriers. Little pitch, if this got your attention, we are hoping to enter in a project shortly where we're going to need some legal researchers to look across the country at this issue. So see me afterwards if you are looking for a summer job this summer. But a really important issue coming forward. The last one I'll mention, which is really financial geeky. These are the kind of titles that get my attention. A water district covenant violation seen as harbinger. Nobody got excited about that title. Did you? I don't even think Martin got excited about it. All right, so this is from the bond buyer. Who loves reading the bond buyer? All right. So this is from the bond buyer, and again, your 1 minute water finance lesson for the day is that the way we finance water projects in this country, municipal projects, is that it's not like a home mortgage where when you borrow money for a home mortgage and you don't pay it back, they take your house. We don't do that for water, wastewater utilities to a large extent. There are a few utilities that have mortgaged their water treatment plant, and you can do that, but it's not very common. Most places will borrow money from a bunch of investors, and they will promise the legal authority to raise rates to pay them back. And the covenant is an agreement between the investors and basically the local government that borrows the money. And the covenant says lots of different things. One of the things it says is every year we are going to collect a certain amount of money from our customers, and it has to be more than we are going to pay you back because investors are nervous. And the only thing they have is the ability to charge for rates. So in the water finance world, we watch very carefully how much revenue is collected every year versus how much people owe. And they have to report if they're collecting too little water, and if you don't, too little revenue. And when you don't collect enough revenue, it actually is seen as a disclosed occurrence on your debt. And bond counsel and bond trustees start to get very angry with you. If Durham does this, they are going to get bond investors very angry with them. We don't see very many utilities doing this across the country, breaking these rules. The fact that we are now starting to see some water utilities break these rules, not have the courage to raise rates, even though they have outstanding debt, could be a harbinger to something scary. So these are the exciting headlines of the week that I wanted to share with you.
Great, thanks to our panelists for really very different kind of prisms for looking at these kinds of issues. And I have a whole list of new publications I need to sign up for, which is exciting. So I guess my role in this panel is to moderate a good discussion. My own interest in this issue comes from work that I did previous to coming to Duke, where I led the Water Sustainability Initiative for the Coca-Cola Company. And so I guess my lens on these issues is to think about what the private sector's interests are in water issues, their dependence on water infrastructure, the quality and quantity of water over the long term, what that looks like on a global basis. Coca-Cola, probably more than almost any company, is dependent on water since it's 98% of everything that the company makes. So, water systems that don't work are a threat to business continuity and a real risk to the viability of the company as it operates around the world. So that's my background, building a kind of business case for private sector engagement in things like public-private partnerships and engagement in with policymakers to try to find solutions to these issues. Currently I do a lot of work on energy issues, and there's obviously lots of connection of the kind of dilemma that utilities in the electric sector are facing as well with, flat or decreasing demand and, pressure on what they charge their customers and the kind of responses that customers take in the case of energy to take more control over their own systems, trying to in some cases, actually defect from the system altogether. So the dynamics, I think, are interestingly similar, but also interestingly different between these different infrastructure sectors. I'd like to start the Q&A section with, kind of an analogy or a metaphor. Some of you may know about Nikola Tesla, who is a real, kind of genius, early founder in terms of developing the early electricity systems. He had a dream of a system that would operate electricity from hydropower in Niagara Falls. And his imagined city was a city that could exist fully on the power of the waterfall at Niagara Falls to power the entire city. Interestingly, his view of that was, he said, I'd like this city to actually have transparent floors, because he thought it was really important that people could see through the floors, see the waterfalls, and see all of the infrastructure and the people it took to be able to run these systems over the long term. I think we're at sort of the Tesla moment in the world of water, where suddenly things that happened below the surface, nobody knew, nobody cared. Every day they pay their bill, but they don't really understand the kind of complexity that makes these systems work over the long term. And I think situations like Flint are sort of shockingly revealing a whole lot of systems that work or don't work, systems of finance, systems of infrastructure, systems of governance that are built around our water systems that suddenly have emerged in the public eye and not just in the bond trader. This is an issue that I think is now in the public consciousness, raising a lot of issues that I think we haven't thought about in great detail. So I'd like to take the Flint issue in particular and try to get a little bit of it's not exactly a postmortem because it's an issue that's unfolding, but if those on the panel would like to speak a little bit, what's happening in Flint? What are the factors politically, financially that are playing a role in this crisis? And to what extent is this idiosyncratic to Michigan or more general, the kinds of things that we could expect to see, over the short to medium term in lots of other places around the world? So I'd like to start with something that's actually, sort of on the public mind about water and see what those of you who work on this issue every day think about it. Martin, you want to kick us off with a kind of take on your view of what's happening in Flint?
So there's two, I think one thing that we are going to see is a lot of people are going to start testing their water. I think there's going to be, I would hope that there are a lot of medium-sized cities around the U.S. that the public kind of rises up and starts to demand certain disclosure. I mean, there's no reason why there shouldn't be public disclosure statements to the ratepayers, the customers, of the quality of their water. I mean, that seems kind of problematic that that's not just kind of standard information that's provided as part of your water bill. The two things that are concerning to me, the first one is that it appears that Congress might bail them out. And I say that, money would be better spent, I think, helping the people that were actually affected by it, but I think that this knee-jerk reaction, like we saw to a certain degree with Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, of when it reaches a crisis and a disaster and federal funds flow back in, it can send a negative incentive to other communities to wait for the disaster, and it also sends a negative, message to cities that have been doing the hard work to avoid this, to paying the bills, to updating their infrastructure. So that one to me is it's disconcerting to see that happen. And maybe the question that I'll punt to the engineer here to my left, an illustrious engineer that advocates for P3s, is I'm always curious about whether this would have happened if the Flint water system was run by a private company. And I think that's, as I was telling somebody earlier, if it was run by a private company, I think we'd be seeing people in jail right now rather than thinking about whether or not they were going to be indicted. And I think that I just find that very interesting of, could this have happened to a private company? I think that's a fair question for P3s to kind of ponder.
That's a difficult question to answer. I haven't worked with private utilities much, but I think it's important to distinguish between a P3 and a private utility. So in a P3, they're competing for perhaps a 30-year concession. You still have public oversight. Yes, I guess I think in my position, I think I'd have to say I don't know. I mean, I think that you could maybe argue that the risk would be lower, but I mean, ultimately, the difficult part on Flint is that the details are still unfolding, but they had used that source water before. And ultimately what happened was, there's a number of things that happened, but the basic sense, they forgot to add chemical to remove the anti-corrosion. And it was unfortunate. But I guess I'd have to say that I'm not sure.
I mean, there was an interesting study a few years ago by the National Association of Water Companies that looked at, and Jeff might know it better than I do, of the number of Safe Drinking Water Act violations between public utilities and private utilities. And the rate of Drinking Water Act violations by private utilities was markedly lower than public utilities.
But to say it couldn't happen, I guess I can't, I don't know that I can say it couldn't happen. I agree with your statistics, though.
And there may be a different approach to risk as a private company than a public entity in terms of the amount of attention and the granularity of assessment that they do around those issues. So, Jeff, any thoughts on the Flint situation? And I guess I'm interested to get your read on how pervasive are these same kind of patterns across the country. That can we expect this kind of thing to happen elsewhere, or do you see a unique convergence of idiosyncratic things in Flint?
Well, and I'm going to focus on the finance to answer that. I think Kevin this morning kind of said that there's a lot of people jumping to judgment, and there's a lot of focus on governance issues, on fairness issues, which I think that dialogue has to occur. But we'll see what that plays out. And those are all many of those issues do seem to be rampant, that at least I'm hearing in the press. But the finance, the core finance, and I actually wrote a blog, if anybody's interested in the 4 finance facts about Flint last week about it. You have to have the number. You have to have a number and alliteration in a blog to get a lot of readers. That's what we discovered. But these are, I think, really important with Flint, and a couple of them I mentioned in my intro. But one is kind of drastic measures require, or drastic times require drastic action, or whatever that quote is. I think the folks in Flint were feeling enormous financial pressure for a variety of reasons, and lots of utilities are, but the Midwestern utilities, Detroit, Flint, just all across, a lot of the folks that you work with, Derek, very old infrastructure relative to, like the relatively new infrastructure we have in kind of fast-growing Southeast. That's all over. That sort of crisis time bomb is not being made up. I mean, just from an engineering standpoint, the pipes in the ground are older and they're reaching their lives faster. And Flint has plenty of that old infrastructure that is starting to fall apart. Even without this, they had enormous price tags for their repairs. And the double whammy is they're in an area that got the short straw from a demographic standpoint, or the way things are playing out. The population in Flint was 200,000 people 25 years ago. It's now under 100,000. For all of those financial pressures, all those water treatment plants, all those fixed costs, and Flint's not alone. We have a lot of places that are losing population. They're losing industrial things. That's what concerns me, is people are going to get pressured into making bad decisions because they are just nervous about meeting the cost. So that's a lesson from Flint. The one that hasn't been talked about that I know you can't not talk about finance without talking about this idea of economy of scale, of regionalization, of collaboration. When I first heard a year ago that Flint, or 2 years ago, that they were pulling out of Detroit, here you have Detroit's water system, which is struggling, about to lose a whole customer base on this idea that it's going to save money. Who's it going to save money for? I mean, I think from society, having these two systems separate is just going to cost more. What happened was the legacy agreement between Detroit and Flint was pretty high, and Flint felt like they could just squeak in to save a little money by doing this pretty complicated engineering route, and they went for it. But the gains they had were directly and more exasperated on the losses that Detroit had. So I just think that is an issue that it comes up in a lot. We see people shooting themselves in the foot. I work all the time with small towns in North Carolina where small town A is building a new water treatment plant when they're next to small town B that has excess capacity, but they don't get along for some reason. And the last little push is that many of those projects only work because of subsidized government loans. So there are many new water treatment plants being built for small systems that would never be built if we didn't have 40-year, 1.5% money available from the federal government. So that's not the case in Flint. I kind of digressed a little bit, but you gave me a soapbox to stand on.
So let me ask Martin and Derek, is this really, there's a lot of people who say the issue is a shortage of capital. We just don't have enough money flowing in to, sustain, renew, and build out a kind of long-term water infrastructure. Is shortage of capital the issue here? It sounds like it's a more complicated picture.
This year I'm spending a year working with Tom at the Department of Interior trying to figure out some alternative finance mechanisms to bring private capital into federal water infrastructure. And in the time that I've been there, one thing that I found in meeting with some of the investors is there is not a shortage of capital out there, that there's a shortage of things. There's a shortage of communication right now, or a shortage of packages of things to invest in that the capital feels comfortable with. And that can generate the miscommunication right now is, as Jeff was saying, the rates that water infrastructure has benefited from historically have been very, very low. And as private capital starts to look at investing in this water infrastructure, whether it's municipal side or whether it's some of these federal assets, those rates are going to have to be higher to attract that private capital. And I think that that's the mismatch that we're seeing now, that we're probably going to have a few years or a decade or so to get through, is kind of a reconciliation of private capital expects higher returns than the federal capital does. So I don't think there's a lack of private capital. I think that it's there, but it's more expensive capital.
Mm-hmm. Derek, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. The gap that does exist is really the gap that we're willing to pay for infrastructure. The federal government, we're just in an environment right now where they're not willing to increase the amount of money they're spending on infrastructure. I think the root of the problem is, we've talked about environmental federalism, And that's going to require more cost recovery at the local level. And the issue is, that Jeff talked about, is affordability. We're seeing it, in my role as an engineer in the Midwest, we're seeing it community after community. As rates go up because the regulatory burden is increased, it's more stringent, the rates have to go up. And I think the ultimate root of the problem for me is that in infrastructure services, the connection between the quality of the service and the rate that they're paying is really fuzzy. And people just have a hard time understanding it. I mean, if you look at wastewater rates going up and potentially doubling because you're adding nitrification, for one, it might not benefit that person. He might not swim in that stream. And for two, they just don't see the benefit, or it's hard for them to understand, the quality of the treatment that you're providing has increased. Your internet service, if it doubles in speed, they see that. Sometimes it's hard for people to understand that on water and wastewater.
Jeff, can you talk a little bit about the different levels of government involvement? You laid out, I think, a pretty good picture of what happens at the local level, but how do you see the kind of governance around water and the different roles of federal, state, and local players?
Well, again, in the kind of municipal finance world, it's an interesting patchwork. We have these federal programs that are universal in every state. The U.S. Department of Agriculture actually is a very large rural water and wastewater funder. We have the Environmental Protection Agency that's a very large water and wastewater funder. The EPA's program, though, is interesting in that it sends money to the states, and then the states can actually create basically their own vision of a water bank in each state using federal funds that were capitalized. And then you start to see some really interesting variety and variation. And so I think a lot of the excitement is on the funding side is what's going to go on in the state. So I think for those of you interested, I would kind of track that. We have a bond coming up in North Carolina in March that it's a $2 billion bond. $300 million of that is going to, if it passes, is going to go in water and wastewater infrastructure. So you have federal money coming down to the state, and then you have states deciding whether they want to sweeten the pot. Sometimes those programs are all interweaved. Sometimes they're completely separate programs. California, Texas have both issued multi-billion-dollar bonds in the last couple of years. So states are kind of coming, I think, some states coming to it. So it's really an interesting issue. And then at the local government level, they're left with being the collectors. And their role is going to, and it has been and it's going to continue to be, to make the case to pay for the bills. And I think the folks from Durham mentioned the value of water. I think that's getting at what you're saying is the old style of responsibility for water, wastewater was kind of out of sight, out of mind. Don't talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about water. Now, local governments more and more across the country are hiring communication officers. They're out at water events. I think that's going to be the exciting role for local governments, is selling the service as an essential service, not one to be embarrassed about.
And just briefly on that, one of the most famous people in D.C. is George Hawkins, who runs D.C. Water. He's just this celebrity in town. And if you think about traditionally of the person who runs the water system being a celebrity, it's a brave new world when a guy can walk around with a D.C. Water shirt and people just stop and thank him for what he does. It's fascinating.
And he hired 32 people in the public information office of DC Water between the time that he got hired.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, Martin, you talked a little bit about the reactive nature of a lot of the decision-making around water. When there's a storm, then money flows and decisions are made and steps are taken. With climate change, what do you see as, I guess I'd like to kind of separate this question in two dimensions. What are the kinds of things that water managers, water infrastructure planners should be thinking about relative to climate change? And then which of those are actually happening? What movement is there really out there around those things? So if you could talk to both kind of what should be the destination around climate change in terms of water planning, and what do we currently see? Where do we fall on that?
I think the best response is to move to the Midwest, right? The upper Mid. Go to the Great Lakes. If you're scared about climate change, go to Flint. But I think in all the reason that Milwaukee is becoming a hub for a lot of water technology, and there's a lot of movement in that direction. I think it's because the lakes represent what we really lack in climate change, which is a battery, a storage system. I mean, I think we see this especially when the people are talking about California and Arizona, that groundwater has always been the buffer, that in years of excess, where the groundwater recharges a bit, and years of shortage, we draw it down. And the problem that we have now is, the Deputy Secretary of Interior said a couple days ago when he said, look, we no longer have drought years in California. We've had 10 years of drought punctuated by a year or so of a little bit of excess. And so that's why we're seeing the battery in the system, the groundwater drawn down. So I think that it's how do we build not excess capacity, but how do we build buffers into the system? And I think that that's the big question. Engineers are not good at thinking that way. It's usually optimized to the particular thing, and so building some slack or some slush in the system is essentially, I think, going to be the response that we need to do into climate change. But that means possibly overbuilding capacity that we don't use on a year-to-year basis.
And that's more expensive too, right?
Yep.
So inevitably, planning for managing across a wider range of variation is more costly at a time that there's a lot of financial pressure already on the system.
That's right.
Derek, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, the simple answer is the investments increase. And I also want to say, going back to the reactive and getting to the planning part of the question, you can't build reservoirs or buffer in the system in the midst of a drought. We have to think about these things in out years and really plan ahead and make proactive investments. It's not something that we can do in a reactive manner. I think we really need to start thinking about these issues in advance and make those investments now. And I guess the other part of that is we're trying to make those investments now when we're trying to figure out how to service what we already have. And so these issues just amplify.
Okay, good. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on what kind of innovation we should be paying attention to in this space from a technology perspective or maybe from a business model perspective. Do you see things, coming in terms of the kinds of, technological options that we have, or maybe it's a, different governance model or different business model for approaching it that you think could play a kind of catalytic role in addressing these things? That this is the kind of question that in many conversations would be central, and in this conversation, innovation doesn't come up a whole lot. It seems like we rely on kind of our existing toolkit. So what are your thoughts on what kind of innovations might make a difference in this space?
Well, there's kind of two that I'm seeing. The one thing that the center that I'm involved with at Interior is part of 4 different centers. One's in transportation, of trying to bring private capital into transportation infrastructure. The other 3 are related to water. The EPA, I forget what it's called, but it has the word resilience in it. And USDA has a similar one of how do we get private capital moving into rural water systems. So one of the innovative things I think the Obama administration has done very well is how do we start to build the intellectual capacity in the federal government that can make these linkages. But I think, my dream is the moonshot for water is similar to, possibly a bad metaphor, is similar to the bomb, developing the bomb. And when we wanted to develop the bomb in the 40s and 50s, they built these national labs, Oak Ridge National Lab, Los Alamos, Santa Fe, and they invested heavily in very, very rapid technological experimentation, super high risk, big reward obviously at the end. And I think, one of my dreams is that part of these national labs would be repurposed to water, and that the moonshot for water or the development of the bomb, the Manhattan Project for water, is something that we've never actually taken seriously. Just, is there a breakthrough technology, whether that's desal, whether it's, something, it's probably something we haven't thought of, but, we need a moonshot or we need a Manhattan Project on water treatment, whether that's for drinking water or for wastewater treatment.
Interesting.
I guess I break it up a little bit into business model innovations and technological innovations. On the business model side, I really, we're talking about P3, and I really see that as a potentially a business model innovation. I was at a World Economic Forum meeting recently, and we were sitting around the table, and this was the future of construction, and these were major players in construction, and they named all the projects that were innovative and that were on time and reduced project life cycle costs. And every example that they came up with was a P3, and there was a realization around the table that P3s were more than about reducing life cycle costs. It was also about unleashing innovation in the sector. One of the things that they noted was they had a facility, a treatment facility, and what they recognized is 3% of the project costs are in design, 30% roughly in construction, and 67% in operations. This facility, they put all the valves on one side of the facility, so the capital costs were higher, but they saved a ton in the O&M side, and they were able to reduce that, the life cycle costs. On the technology side, I really see the Internet of Things and, mobile citizen science, being able to test and have real-time information, not only in reservoir operations, but, detecting leaks. I see that, the cost of sensors going down, and the Internet of Things being potentially a game changer in the infrastructure space.
Do you think privacy issues will be
Yes.
there in that? I know it is on the electricity side as well. Is that discussion live on the water side too? You don't want
Very much.
Very much so.
visibility into those?
For irrigators of
Right.
Yeah.
knowing whether or not they're actually watering their fields is something that's come up. I mean, the biggest pushback against the Internet of Things on water has been from the agriculture sector.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was thinking about that in the Western Water Panel too, about the extent to which these things really are monitored and visible to whom and in what ways has to be a big part of the equation too. If you think about trading regimes, you need pretty, concrete, specific information. Jeff, what's your bag of tricks that you'd like to pull out on water issues?
I'm a one-trick pony. Pricing. No, I mean, I think the water industry, and I speak as a recovering utility director myself, it's a slow moving. I mean, innovation is, technological they've always embraced, but finance, innovation, pricing, we price water like we priced it 40, 50 years ago. Think of the other kind of commercial entities out there. Do you pay for phone calls now like you paid for it 15 years ago or last month for that matter? I mean, pricing of so many other services, airline tickets, financial services, they've evolved. I think there are interesting ways to price water, both at the retail level, but then also on the wholesale contract level, on the water transfer level. So I think we're going to see some interesting ways of doing it. Whether you call affordability kind of pricing innovative or not depends on your perspective, but I think by necessity, something's going to give with pricing. So whether we have a national water stamp program or some other type of innovative program, I think the way we have subsidized water is not particularly innovative. In the past, it's pour in a little subsidy at the top of the utility and count on the utility to kind of sprinkle it down to their customers. So in other words, give a tax exemption or give a grant to the utility. It offsets the utility's price, and it drops the price a little bit for everyone. In other areas and things that we subsidize, it's much more targeted. You go to the folks that need help. And I've seen some analyses, and we've done some of the analyses, that you could get a lot bigger bang for your buck if you could figure out a way of, instead of reducing the cost for everybody, of kind of creating this targeted plan. But it's controversial. There are many in the water industry that think having people pay anything less than their fair share, or their cost of serving them, is not necessarily innovative. But I think it's going to come. It's going to be interesting to watch.
Great. Well, I hope that all of you have found a panel on water financing to be a whole lot more interesting and provocative than you thought it might be today. So mission accomplished if we did that. I'd like to turn it over to all of you to hear what kind of questions have emerged from the conversation we've had so far.
Hannah wants to know if the heat can be turned up, evidently.
I was curious about, you talked about Manhattan Project for perhaps desalination. I was curious, how much more efficient does desal need to be in order to be an economically viable solution?
And I'm going to flag Chuck to see, he might have an answer as well. If the cost per unit of water starts to reach as a recovering libertarian, maybe, if the cost of treatment for desal starts to reach the cost of exchanges of water, then it might. Then I think we've started to reach a point. The ideal is for it to be lower than that. Chuck, do you have any side?
I think it's really close, depending on where you are. The newest desal right now is you compare it to the wholesale price that Met is charging for for water that they import from Colorado, and it's
They've reached the price point recently.
I mean, you know, it's in that sort of fuzzy area where the lines are crossing, or they will within the life of the project. So I think they'd argue that it's, if that's what you're comparing it to, is the wholesale price, it's something like that. If you're looking at it compared to, you know, what the prices of irrigators of a reclamation projects, where it's not even close to that. But for some of what the municipalities are charging out in the Southwest, it is.
Yeah, maybe, I think San Diego is pretty close. In a lot of locations, it's higher. Maybe, I'm not gonna put a number on it, but the only note I would add to the desal is, I think it's gonna solve some problems locally, but it's not a panacea. I mean, if you look at where water is, you know, pulling out of the ocean or some groundwater, there's high salinity that you use desal for, or RO, reverse osmosis, but a lot of where you're using water is in the Midwest and, you know, irrigated agriculture, and you're not gonna pump water, you know, hundreds of miles from a desal plant that's already expensive to, you know, irrigate cornfield. So, I mean, it doesn't completely solve our water problem. I think it maybe does a lot to address it on the coast in Southern California, certainly, but it doesn't completely solve the problem.
Well, the carbon footprint and the waste
Right.
issues associated
Right.
with it, so it's not just a matter of cost either.
Right.
There's some interesting technology being developed at Arizona State where they have a superfine membrane that the ideal is that you could irrigate crops with salt water, with saline water, and that the hydraulic gradient to drive the reverse osmosis could actually be generated by the hydraulic gradient generated by the plants themselves. And so that's the dream, is to be able to have the plants drive the gradient that would actually push it through the membrane. And so, you know, science solves everything, right? So we'll get there. We'll get somewhere.
That sounds like a Manhattan project.
There
There
we
you
go.
go.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
There's a lot we don't know, but there are two parts of the story we haven't heard much about that I think have potential finance implications. And one Jeff mentioned, which I'm so glad you did, right, which is the Detroit side of the story that people aren't talking about. And the fact that Detroit is this struggling city that has a pretty robust water system, right, with a great water source, and it's a well-run system, at least, you know, technically, right? And so one question is, what do we know about the degree to which big cities with big water systems are using their water to cross-subsidize other government operations, or to even cross-subsidize to their own impoverished residents, right? Or, you know, charging outside boundary rates to help their own residents. And the other one is, and this is one I don't know much about, right? But it strikes me that the human capacity, the technical capacity to run a water utility where you're selling treated drinking water that you've, you know, imported from a neighboring jurisdiction is much lower than the technical capacity that you need to draw from a raw source and treat the drinking water, right? So you had Flint make this transition from, you know, Detroit water to treating their own raw source. And the finance question that I have for that is, when utilities are making technological investments, how are they thinking about the finance balance of technology on the front end versus operations costs down the road? How are they thinking about, you know, what are the human capacity requirements of running this kind of operation versus that?
Well, one of the more interesting documents to take a look at, again, you know where I'm coming from, but is a financial analysis for a consolidation option. And it's amazing when you look at them how, and I've looked at plenty of them, how the town looking at going it solo, the estimate they get is ekes out by dollars, you know, by cents on the dollar, the cost of remaining or going with a partner utility. And so, but it's just enough to give people financial cover to go that route. If you go back in time and go back and look at how the construction costs come in, often it doesn't work out like the assumptions were, and it was not only was it a, you know, bad governance decision, it was a bad finance decision. But so I think we have to be we have to look pretty carefully at those go solo options. So and they're all different, and there's lots of different scenarios, and how far you have to transfer. I mean, some regionalization isn't financially viable because you're sending water long distances, or wastewater just as much harder to move around. But I think there are some bad projects moving forward. On the first question, there are some high-profile places that we know where you collect money from water customers, that goes up to the utility, and a big chunk of that gets transferred over to the general fund of the local government, and then that goes to building libraries. We know that occurs. It just needs to occur in a few places for it to become this like urban myth that it occurs everywhere. I don't see it occurring nearly as much as it might have 10 or 15 years ago, but there are cases where it's occurring. And sometimes it's hidden, that a utility might have to pay an indirect cost to their parent government for the finance director and the city manager and the legal staff. I think one of my utility friends complained that they had 4 city lawyers working on their behalf based on what they were being charged every year, the utility, by the general government for legal services. So there's some hidden sort of transfers there, but I don't think it's nearly as much of an issue. I think the more interesting issue now is the shortfalls and the money going the opposite direction. We have a number of rural communities I work with in North Carolina where they're using their taxes, to put it in, and maybe they should be, but they're doing it on an ad hoc basis. They're just bleeding, and they can't balance the budget, so they're moving it in.
Yes.
Yeah, so you all brought up that there's certainly no shortage of private capital, nor is there a shortage of uses on the public side, on the infrastructure side. But what we're really looking at is a kind of information asymmetry that investors aren't comfortable with, the risks, they don't understand the environmental risks, the idiosyncratic risks with certain water infrastructure projects. I mean, is that a tacit call for, a new entity, an advisory board? I mean, how do you bridge that gap? Certainly, time will do it. It's done it before for different financing mechanisms and assets. But how do you accelerate that?
If I understand the question, there is like in Canada, there is an infrastructure exchange, and we have a West Coast infrastructure exchange, and they've viewed a disconnect between the capital and the people that need the capital, and they're kind of working as middle people to kind of convey and make, and we do a little of that work too. So I think that is coming, and I think that's kind of greasing some of the deals to go through of kind of better bid documents, better contract documents, better, I think, translation of what risk is fair to transfer. I mean, often you have really unrealistic expectations on kind of risk transfer. I mean, somebody says, we want you to take it all, and we know you're going to charge us a little bit, but just charge us a little bit more. But they've offloaded a very significant amount of risk. So I think that is going to make some of the deals go forward, and there's been talk about doing more of that kind of middleman kind of deal making here. But I think that there's also examples where it's some of this capital needs 14, some of the equity investors need 13, 14% returns based on what they promised their investors. And it's hard. I mean, there's not that many water deals out there that even if they transfer risk, you can structure to pay 13 or 14% interest on a 10 or 20-year debt when you have this amazing municipal bond market that, if you have any decent credit quality at all, can produce, in this market, 3.5% rate of return, for 25 years. So that's a big financial gap. So I sometimes scratch my head. I think it's only going to go so far. Now, when the interest rate environment changes, or we could see more deals going on. But that's last one is an obstacle for some deals as well.
I think you are seeing a few more consulting firms that are emerging. I mean, just in the time that I've known the Duke alum, George Raftelis, his company went from a little regional shop in Charlotte to, he's got offices, it seems like, all over the place now. And his role is to kind of facilitate a better, kind of like Jeff's shop of, an education role, and in his case, a formal consulting role for municipalities to kind of do, think about pricing, analyze the finance side of that. But I agree with Jeff that, money's so cheap right now that there's not 14% to be made, and there's got to be some kind of economic reckoning, as well as I think that those sides are going to be coming together over the next few years. But I think you are going to see the infrastructure exchanges. There's the Interbasin or the Intermountain, the Rocky Mountain Infrastructure Exchange. We're starting to see a few more of these emerge that are trying to bridge those gaps.
Good. Michelle?
I wanted to just follow up on your point about pricing, Jeff. That, back 15 years ago, before we had any kind of tiered pricing in North Carolina, a lot of the municipalities were very concerned about what this was going to do to their revenue. And if you did anything that was going to encourage conservation, they weren't going to be able to pay their bills. They weren't going to be able to, ensure proper treatment and things. But now we've had more communities adopt that tiered pricing. Do you have a sense of how that has affected their bottom line, and secondarily, how it has affected overall water uses? Has it succeeded in encouraging conservation and more efficiency?
For the last one, for some utilities, yes, but pricing is so utility specific. The increasing block rate structure that Durham showed is a pretty kind of middle of the range steps. We have some utilities, Santa Fe, I think, has a step that goes from here up to the ceiling. Some of those have really high steps, so that they've Cary and Owasso have pretty much priced out irrigation in their service areas. Their rates for irrigation are significantly more, I think, than Durham. So there are some examples where it's worked phenomenally well. The first question, though, whether this conservation has been the thing that has killed people on the bottom line is I gave a lot of utilities the benefit of the doubt. The first couple of years they were sort of caught off guard, but now we have 10 years of data. We know all of the water standards that went into place that had nothing to do with irrigation rates, but they were just, now everyone's buying water efficient washer and dryers and toilets. All of that has driven down water usage. For a lot of folks, they got caught off guard with that, and it was poor projections. It's not water rates that kill your financial bottom line, it's poor projections. Or it's the fear of worst case scenarios. A lot of utilities are really nervous about, at budget time, saying, but what if it looks like this? And they do that scenario, and they say, oh, that's horrible. Let's not even talk about that. But that's what's been happening in places like Paradise. I think people need a little bit more courage to be okay, with climate change, with all of these other things, and it's happening. The talk about like conservation killing our rates, that was the buzz term, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. I think a lot of utilities have, quote, grown up, and they figured out that they got to be really conservative with their projections, and it's flattening out a little bit. But it's been interesting to watch the kind of the up and down. I think almost every urban area has had some version of that headline I read to you from Paradise is, you asked us to conserve, and now you're raising our rates. If you did your projections well as a water utility manager, I'm not looking at anybody out here, but if you change your rate structure, you should take into consideration the basic economic principle that people are going to use less, and you should kind of model it in. And that's occurring now, but it was hard for a number of years for people to get it right.
Let me wrap up our panel with a parting thought question. Many of the audience are students. Should they consider a career in water? And if so, where should they go? Where are the big opportunities over the next few decades as you look at this space? Is it a place that you want to be? So just a quick word of career advice, and we'll wrap up.
Well, I guess there's maybe a few law students in here. All of these P3s are leveraged hard on their contracts that set up this whole thing. So I have to imagine that as a law student looking at really, there are very few people who understand the wonky details of P3 contracts, and I have to imagine that as mundane as that may sound, it's actually going to be something that I think I'd keep my eye on the number of P3s that actually go through on the infrastructure side, and that's a niche market. As I tell my students all the time, I think that the municipal side of water is going to be an exploding growth market right now. And I think the federal government is shedding jobs. They're devolving a lot of things to the state and local level, and I think that's where the more interesting and exciting jobs are, is to fix the infrastructure problems and the finance problems that exist at the local level.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think the market is robust. You know, putting a plug in for my own company, HCR, and they're, you know, it's a growing firm. The firms that I've been with before seem to be growing. This problem has been a long time coming, and I think it's not going to go away in a couple of years. So I think it's there's large opportunities in the water sector.
More of the same. Our center works on energy finance and land conservation finance and other areas, and I've just found, at least, and I don't know if it's the same at Duke, but with Carolina students, they love energy finance. Water finance has still been a hard sell, so we get tons of students, and I think they're both interesting, and I think they're interrelated, but I would make a big plug for kind of, we've just scratched the surface of some of the interesting kind of water deals, finance issues. We didn't really talk at all about distributed green infrastructure or other aspects that are going to really challenge the way we think about utilities. So yes, I think it's an interesting world, and if you get sick of Duke, you can do what I did, and I went to Duke undergrad and went to Carolina for grad school. So,
and with a cross-school plug, we'll end the panel. Thanks very much to our panelists.